Simeon. An early start after a very good day one. Thank you. And yeah, we're going to talk a little bit more about the basics with the level one principles. And I know we have a couple of really good students of the level one project here. So I may call on you as we go along. But for anyone else that I haven't met yet, I'm Elizabeth McQuarrie, one of the partners with Glenbrook, and we have been helping the Gates Foundation with the level one project since the beginning. And so it's really amazing and gratifying to see this vibrant Mojaloop community that we got to experience yesterday. And I'm with Jean Nair, my colleague. I think, Jean's not on mic just at the moment. But we're going to talk about the second portion of a very condensed version of what is the Level 1 project. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump in. I certainly, if anyone has questions, encourage you to raise your hand. It's a little hard to see with the lights, or just stand up, perhaps. So the first thing I just want to call everyone's attention to is the placemat in front of you, which is a very basic representation of some of the key elements of how we go from what was the Level 1 project, which was first articulated in 2017. So, a few years ago, but now we're at the Mojaloop convening here in Kigali. So what I'm trying to do with the placemat is sort of draw a direct line between, all of the principles of the Level 1 project to Mojaloop and how they fit together. So what we're doing in our two brief sessions, yesterday and today, is to sort of, if you will, flesh that out just a little bit, make it more real for you. But that's your cheat sheet, on the placemat. So yesterday we talked about some of the high level principles of what is the Level 1 project. That are clearly, as we show on the placemat, that affordability and usefulness are the most important foundational aspects. So these are our core goals. And so how do we take these goals and ultimately translate them into a payment system? It's a journey as well as a significant endeavor to take these goals and translate them into how people pay every day, right? And how the implementation of an inclusive instant payment system can be the key to that. So yesterday we talked at the high level. Now we're going to get down into the scheme just a little bit. First, we're going to talk about scheme governance. So scheme governance, is really when you have your payment system, all of the things that you do to make it work, to manage it, right? So the first thing that will come to everyone's mind in scheme governance is perhaps ownership, right? So who are the entities, whether it's the central bank, the commercial banks, or a different type of association? Someone has to take ownership of this project, right? And that is, sort of the execution as well as the payment system itself. So the scheme is running the payment system, and the scheme is going to manage the payment system, which means it's going to develop rules. It's going to have, be the owner of the rule book and all of the procedures. It also means that they are going to ensure that these goals continue to live in our daily practice. So what we have here is that, scheme, think about it as all of the management approaches and decisions that really form the payment system. So in order to do that, you're going to have a set of rules, right? And you're going to, that those rules look a little bit, your table of contents might look a little bit about like this chart that we have here. And this is just a sort of, if you will, a shell to give us some discussion. So we have our scheme rules. So that's all of the things that our participants, right, in the payment system must abide by. And a good set of rules would also include the things that the payment system is responsible for to the participants, right? This is a two-way relationship between the participants and the scheme providing the services. So, people, I think, have a general understanding of what payment system rules would do. And we have more general rules and kind of, if you will, more technical rules. And those technical rules are typically in an annex, which is, incorporated between the body of the rules as well as the technical and operating guidelines. But they're really more than guidelines, right? Because they're part of our rule book. They are requirements as well. So what would go in that? Payment flows as well as requirements around how you potentially, the timing, end-to-end timing of a payment, APIs, how we utilize them, what else could be included, formatting of the transaction, all of those specifications, getting down to the next level of detail. That would what would be in the operating and technical guidelines. But also part of the rule book are participation agreements. And these are actually more fundamental than the scheme rule book, because we have to have participants in our payment system. And in a level 1 aligned payment system, those participants are banks and non-banks, which are licensed to carry out payment transactions and hold transaction account, balances for their customers. So that's an important distinction as well that I just want to refresh from yesterday, that the payment system, the inclusive instant payment system in there inside, we had I think the org chart of what a payment system roles look like, that you need to have your relationship with the participants, and they have to be agreeing to the payment system, right? So that typically the participation agreement into this scheme payment system is part of the rule book, because by agreeing to be a participant, they are also agreeing to all of the rules that are in the rule book. And in an inclusive instant payment system, we also see that this is where the guidance to the participants, to the DFSPs, that's where it's going to be contained on, how we're going to get to an inclusive outcome for the end users. And that really sort of draws this conversation full circle, because the inclusive instant payment system and its scheme, their relationship is with the DFSPs or the participants. You don't have a relationship with the end users. That is what the DFSPs participants have, right? So how do we ensure that we draw, our thread is really strong from the payment system all the way out to the end user? So this is the function of the rule book, to do all of those things. So you can see why it's such a really critical document. So who are these, scheme governance entities? I mentioned that, it might be a central bank, it might be the commercial banks that own or that stand up the payment system, but we need a governance around the payment system that is, if you will, broader than the actual ownership. Of course, ownership is critical. These are the folks that are taking responsibility for making the project work end to end. But when you get to a scheme governance body, it might be one of these flavors here. We have central bank led, that where they're deciding what all of the rules are and what happens within the payment system. It could be commercial led. And even in the case of central bank led or associations, you're going to see in just a moment, this is really like the office that, the director's office that takes care of all of the things that go on. And in an inclusive instant payment system, that means listening to other voices within our payment system. So governance includes the ability for the participants, whether they are owners or not, to have a voice in how the payment system is running, right? So that needs to be enshrined in our rules as well. And then something that we're seeing a good bit more these days is the possibility of an association-led model. So a group of entities or group of interests that want to have an inclusive instant payment system that come together not just from ownership itself, but for the desire to manage a payment system. And of course, they may be separate from the ownership, but the ownership could still be another important layer there. So I mentioned inclusive governance, right? So speak to a couple of the attributes of that. So the Level 1 project advocates that there be equal opportunities for all participants to become owners. This is honestly, it's often highly aspirational because if it's owned by the central bank, how do you become an equal owner, right? That's a tough challenge. And we realize that it's not always possible, but it is certainly how we anchor the sort of foundations philosophy of governance, because if you have the possibility to become an owner, you would also be responsible for ensuring that we have an inclusive instant payment system. But even if that is not a real possibility, for example, the central bank is the owner of the payment system, we have robust participant engagement. So opportunities for the participants, whether it's through committees or votes or working groups, that they be able to have a voice in the future of the payment system and how that, what sort of use cases are prioritized, technical matters, all the things that are truly important to the people or the entities, the DFSPs that are using our payment system. Because remember, they're our customers, right? We need to respect their views into the system. And finally, and most importantly, that all of the governance aspects need to ensure a pro-poor posture, as it's described here, but that all of the decisions and actions that we take within the payment system are designed to create pro-poor outcomes. So one of those pro-poor outcomes is the principle of a not-for-loss payment system. And I think we're going to hit that here for just a moment. So what is a scheme operating on a not-for-loss or a cost recovery? Sometimes cost recovery plus investment is another way that it is referred to. This is our business model, right? So how the scheme itself is organized. And this is the opposite of a for-profit model. Regardless of what we call it here, this is scheme is not for the profit of the scheme owners. This is for broader outcomes within not only the payment system, but also in the economy overall. because they, we're doing this to make our countries, our regions better, right? And if we take profit from the payment system, it's going to be very, very hard to ultimately end up with low or no end user fees, right? Because we need to do everything we can. Every decision must be based on how we create a more inclusive, affordable, and useful outcome. So this is another key principle that is highly related to the not-for-loss, low or no end user fees. So just a little bit more on that and what it means on a basis, on a daily basis. Again, it's not a commercial venture, right? We're not paying dividends to our shareholders. We are taking our revenues that are above our costs, right? So our earnings, and we are reinvesting them in the payment system itself. So in setting your pricing, we are not, trying to generate profit, but we do need to generate a bit of a surplus because we have to think about tomorrow, right? So that's what plus investment would mean. We're going to have a plan, a roadmap of what our investments need to be. Again, whether it's a new use case or whether we are moving towards a new cloud server because we are doing very well and we need to have more capacity. Those things need to be on our roadmap as well as in our budget. So that's where the excess, if you will, goes, the plus in investment, and that is, retained within the payment system. And just one final point here, that this is all of the things that I'm focusing on today are really about what happens within the payment system. And we are part of a broader ecosystem. We have participants, DFSPs, and they are in two different spaces, because where we are, as we briefly illustrated yesterday, is in the collaborative or cooperative space. This is our, our payment rails, our rule book. We collaborate on all of that. The DFSPs are also commercial entities, right? They're serving end users. They have customers that are end users. Our customers, again, are the DFSPs themselves. But, this is one of the, if you will, sort of subtle points here, that the DFSPs most often are commercial entities. So they do need to generate a profit. And this is another layer of our challenge here, that we want to create the conditions for them to serve everyone at an affordable price, right? So that's what we're doing by keeping our costs low in the payment system, giving them low fees for using the payment system, and also that they then have to turn around and offer this to their end users. We are going to encourage them to offer this at our services for low or near zero. And we're enabling them to do that by having ultra low fees in the middle, right, in the payments system itself. But they do have to make a profit, right, to exist or continue to exist. So we have to, allow for that margin that they themselves can make a profit here. We just want to enable them to do it, to make that profit margin for this service very low, because scale will bring them to a larger number overall. Gene, you want to jump up here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and good morning, everyone. As Elizabeth has said, I am a senior consultant to Glenbrook, and I'll take you through some of the more technical or less governance aspects of this conversation. So what you see on the screen in front of you is a typical flow that we have, or the typical sort of ecosystem players. And Elizabeth has already talked through who the payer and the payee are, and who the DFSPs are. So I'll focus in on the middle part. And the middle part has essentially two components. One is inclusive instant payment system. And Elizabeth has covered the scheme part. And just to recap very briefly, it is the non-physical part of IIPS. It is the part that deals with documents, processes, procedures. It is committees that are convened. And then there is the operating platform that is a physical implementation of the rules, if you will. These are actually the people and the software and the hardware that takes transactions that are initiated by the payer, go through DFSP, and process them through the switch to deliver them to the receiver's DFSP and then to the payee. And it has, at least at the high level, three major components. One is the switch itself. So very frequently, we will see that, particularly if a DFSP is an e-money institution, the bulk of their transfers are between their customers. But what happens when they need to go outside of their walled garden? Remember, DFSP in a way is a closed loop network, and get to somebody who is not part of that network. Well, then you need to go to the switch, and the switch needs to know who to transition to. And how do they know that? Sometimes the transaction is addressed by the actual bank ID. However, in many use cases, we don't want the DFSP's customers to use bank IDs because that's unwieldy, or they're already used to a different method of addressing. And that's why we need to have a directory in order to allow for user-friendly ways of addressing the message. And then as the messages go through, it creates settlement positions. So if the sender DFSP is debited and the receiver DFSP is credited equal amounts, at some point, that needs to be brought into balance. That is a settlement process that is done typically within IIPS on a notional basis, and then in communication with a settlement bank, which is very frequently the central bank, to then actually take these notional money movements and make them permanent on the books of the central bank. And of course, the other key component of IIPS is fraud management. And you might ask yourself, why is it not the responsibility of a DFSP? And it really is. It is the responsibility of everyone to do fraud management. DFSPs have unique opportunities because they know your customer, and because they actually have a lot of context around the transaction being initiated. Things like, is this on a good device? Is this in the location that I expect? How does it fit with the other types of transactions that are going through the DFSP? But what they don't have is they don't have the overall view of payment flows through the entire economy. And that's where IIPS comes in. They have that view, and so they can see patterns across DFSPs. And through these patterns, they can see mule networks, they can see structuring, they can see things which are not visible to the DFSP. And then that's the type of fraud management that they will do. And then also one of the key responsibilities of the scheme typically is to educate DFSPs on best practices, provide them the forum for fraud data sharing, and enable continual improvement because of two things. One is we all know that fraudsters always test the targets for vulnerability. And obviously, when you deploy a new network for the first time, that appears to be a soft target. So there will be many, many attacks in the initial days. So it's really important to make sure that day one, the network is hardened against fraud. And then fraud continually evolves. And so it is critically important to have the forum where you can share. These are the fraud attack vectors that we are seeing. These are the fraud mitigation strategies that we are using and replicating these best practices across all of the DFSPs in the ecosystem, because as you know, what fraudsters do is the same as any burglar or a car thief will do. They will go from DFSP to DFSP to see which one has the window open, which one left the door unlocked, which one has the weak fraud controls, and that's where they will attack. So it is important for the ecosystem to make sure that the weakest link in the system is actually quite strong. So we briefly touched on the participants, but the three key roles are scheme owner, and Elizabeth has talked through that a lot. One thing I will mention again, because it's really critical, in the case where it is unclear where the scheme ends and the operator begins, it is really important to have a separation. So we have certainly seen that when a central bank is both a scheme owner and an operator, there are separate departments, one that performs scheme management and one that performs the operating functions. And they are not beholden to each other. They are independent. And so you actually have the situation where the scheme owner will have an adversarial posture occasionally against the operator, only because for the good of the entire ecosystem, when when one entity identifies problems, they need to be brought in. They cannot be hidden. The platform operator, again, is responsible for processing transactions and dealing with the scheme. And there, we're looking for operational excellence. These are the people who make sure that they monitor transactions. They're the ones who run the fraud and complaints and resolution services if those are provided within IIPS. They are the ones who provide the value-added services if those services are defined within the scheme. And then we have participants. And again, this is probably the easiest thing to do, to think about, because we all know who are the depository institutions in our economy. But Elizabeth has mentioned this term, direct participants and indirect participants. And in a traditional RTGS or an ACH schemes, we do have many examples where a DFSP has other DFSPs as its customers, and it acts as a gateway for those DFSPs into the scheme. Now, real-time payments is different. Inclusive instant payments are different because of the stringent real-time requirements and real-time availability of funds to the end user. And so the best practice these days is to encourage everyone to be a direct participant. And frankly, these days, again, because of the non-core participants in the ecosystems, the fintechs, the technical enablers, there is no longer a barrier to being a direct participant. Nobody is too small to be a direct participant. Technology has been a great leveler to allow any institution, however big or however small, to have the same capabilities. And that really is one of the objectives of level one. We want everyone to be included on the same terms. So let's look a little bit deeper into what does the day in the life of an instant payment system looks like. And we really look at two stages. One is the stage of clearing. This is really nothing more than an information exchange between the payee and the payor, mediated by the sending DFSP and the receiving DFSP. And so you collect all of the information on a transaction. And let me use a slightly non-traditional example of an individual paying their taxes. So a payer will drop into a specific payment message that tells them not just what their amount is, what their account to debit, but it will also have all of the elements necessary to, as defined by what the tax payment in a given jurisdiction is. DFSP will deliver it through the IIPS to the DFSP that has been selected to serve as the tax collection agency bank or financial institution. And in real time, the tax obligations of the payee, of the payor, would be satisfied because the amounts will be applied immediately. But that creates a settlement obligation between these two DFSPs. How is that settled? How is that brought into balance? There are three main ways that we see that happening. And honestly, they all work. The one that is simplest to explain is real-time gross settlement, which is not the system real-time gross settlement. It just uses the same words to say that sometimes it's called line-by-line settlement. In other words, every time a transaction goes through the switch communicates with the settlement bank, which is typically the central bank, to say this obligation, let's say the amount was 1,000. In real time, they tell the central bank, please adjust the accounts of the sending and the receiving DFSP by 1,000. So what's happening is that settlement positions are always true and are always correct in real time. However, that creates a set of challenges. That does mean that the settlement bank has to be online 24/7. That's not always possible. It does mean that the settlement bank has to have the same level of resiliency as IIPS, and frequently that is 4 or 5 nines. Again, that is not always the case. So then what we see is another model is a deferred net settlement. So for example, the simplest case is there is one settlement per day. So once every 24 hours, the settlement positions that have been captured in IIPS are then delivered to the settlement bank, and it is once a day that the true positions on the book of a central bank are adjusted. So, and within that process, there are 3 variations. One variation is the transactions are still delivered line by line. So if you can think of a giant settlement file, right? So if 10,000 transactions or 1 million or 1 billion transactions went through IIPS in in the settlement period, that 1 million or 1 billion lines are going to be delivered to the settlement bank. Another alternative is that only the positions are delivered. So regardless of how many transactions went through the switch, if you have 100 DFSPs, then only 100 times 99 divided by 2, which is the number of bilateral positions, will be delivered to the IIPS, to the settlement bank, and will be settled. And there is a third variation that is gaining traction a little bit, and it looks a lot like a wallet. And that is IIPS keeps track of these positions, but instead of sending it to the settlement bank and saying, okay, settle it, the DFSPs are managing their liquidity position, and they're seeing what it is in IIPS. And if the position gets out of the high and low watermarks, let's say, so if it's either too high or too low, then they instead instruct the settlement bank to either add to the position or transfer excess position to the settlement bank. So it's a very different way of thinking about it, but it does simplify the operating complexities and risk. So again, we do not have a specific position on which settlement mechanism is better. It all works in with what works for a specific country. We do find that in the beginning, DNS tends to be the preferred choice because it's familiar. But over time, people migrate either to the cash management or RTGS type settlements because they do reduce risk. And part of the cost to DFSP is the amount of risk they have to carry on their books. So the lower we can bring down that number, the lower the operating costs are going to be. So if there are no questions around that, and we frequently do get a lot of questions around this, I'll move forward to the next one. And remember, in addition to the switching, without which you cannot have IIPS, we've mentioned two other services which from an L1 perspective we consider to be key. One is addressing. And in these geographies, interconnecting e-money institutions is one of the key drivers for inclusive instant payment switch. And what do we know about e-money is that frequently provided by an MTN and frequently done by having users pay to a mobile number. So even in an inclusive and interconnected payment system, mobile number continues to be a very common and a very useful identifier. And we want to meet people where they are. And if they're happy to use a mobile number, or if they're happy to use email, which is popular in many jurisdictions, we must be able to offer that on an interconnection basis as well. Now, remember that one of the key objectives of L1 is low cost. One of the ways of getting to low cost is maximum scale. One of the ways of getting to maximum scale is as many use cases as possible. One of the key use cases is P2G, B2G, G2P, and G2B. And frequently in the government-based use cases, national ID tends to be the identifier that's required. When you make your tax payments, you need to include your tax ID, when you, et cetera, et cetera. So that becomes a very popular identifier. And that has been the case for a number of years in the initial implementations, but now we have a lot more experience. And what we're seeing that in addition to these identifiers, people are clamoring for something that is more flexible. For example, choosing your own alias. If you are a micro merchant and you want to make it easy for people to interact with you, to pay you, you don't necessarily want to have uh, a, a very convoluted email address that spells out the name of your shop. You want to have an alias that is more directly understandable as this is my flower shop, or I am the electric company. So that is what one identifier we see very frequently. And then the other one that we see is driven by the fraud considerations. In countries where the fraud is high, the well-known identifiers become targets of the attack. And so what we see is people create randomly generated aliases that they share, and they're very difficult to remember. They're completely nonsensical, just letters and numbers. They're long. But if you're using a smartphone, if you're using a computing device, and your scheme has actually codified the rules around cut and paste, these aliases become very effective, that you can still do everything you can, and they're very secure, which brings us into the next phase of this, the other core service, which is fraud. So BMGF, or level 1 fraud mitigation principles, are just what you would expect them to be. Elizabeth already covered one, which is liability. And the one sort of clarification I would make is victims are not liable for confirmed fraud payments. And so here's the two key points. One is, in the fraud, there is always a victim and there is always a fraudster. Fraudster has no rights in the scheme. And second is, what is the fraud? If you paid for a good and the good came in damaged, is that fraud, or is that a dispute that you have to that you have to work out with the merchant? Those are some of the things that are good to have captured at the scheme level. And then also the services that we didn't show in the scheme, but frequently occurs, is the claims adjudication service. And again, it's good. One of the best practices is to have an independent entity that provides arbitration, but let's not go into too deep of a details. The second is rules. And again, we talked about example of DFSP should really be very clear on managing fraud risk through scheme rules. What is the responsibility of a DFSP? What is the responsibility of its customers? And what is the responsibility of the scheme itself? The scheme provides the tools. So for example, we are here, and one of the tools that's offered is Tazama, which is an open source fraud mitigation tool. And the final principle is data. All fraud is about stealing customer data, stealing customer SIM data, et cetera, and then using it for nefarious purposes. And that, of course, means we want to protect it. Fraud data sharing is required in order to make the entire ecosystem fraud resistant, but it has to be balanced against the privacy and security principles that the jurisdiction has. And even if they're not terribly strong, again, one of the objectives of L1 is to continue to raise the bar. And so this is an opportunity around putting strong privacy and security principles around the data. Now, let's switch to the implementation. And implementation is a significant undertaking, as you know. We're frequently asked, how long does it take? And it does not take weeks. It is months, and sometimes month in a multiple of 6. However, the key thing here is to realize that it's not just about the software stack and the hardware stack. So if you look at numbers 8 and 9, that is really what Mojaloop and Tazama are, right? It is the set of software objects that get deployed on the hardware stack. But beyond that, you need a platform service provider. And frequently we talk to the operators, and their experience is in running an RTGS or running an ACH or running a debit card switch. And even though they're very similar, there are nuances around how you do settlement, how you do fraud, how do you do other operating processes that need to be worked through before the implementation. And it's the same for GFSP, or retail provider participants, as it is described here. They have experience with some types of money movements. This is new. Frequently, this requires upgrades to the technical staff, frequently requires upgrades to their operating procedures, because operating in a 24/7/365 environment is frequently something that they're not used to. And also, frequently standing up a new rail is new. So how do you promote the new rail? How do you evangelize it? Those are all of the things that are new and need to happen there. And then continuing up the stack, and I'm not going to go through every one, but again, the key thing on this slide is that it has to be inclusive of all stakeholders. We have certainly observed that in jurisdictions where central bank or government entities do not take a strong participatory role in rolling out this rail, the adoption of the rail tends to be on the slower side. And so that is the real key takeaway. And so at this point, I will turn it over to Elizabeth to bring us home.
Yeah, thank you. That last slide really reminded us that this is an ecosystem, right? And it's a broad one, which can take a long time to get aligned. But when it is fully aligned, that is the power, right? That everyone is working towards the same financial inclusion, inclusive payment system outcome. So that's why we sort of continue to focus on these issues, because this is a broad challenge for us all. But obviously we know it can be done, and certainly successfully. And one thing is, you've heard about the Level 1 project. We have a website. Spoiler alert a little bit, it's not as good as it could be. And we would like your help in improving it. And that's really, if you could just take less than 5 minutes and either go to the QR code or the small URL and take a survey about how we can make the Level 1 website better. And this is an active project right now. So your input will have a very quick, it'll be, put into a very important pipeline of how the website is shaping up. And thank you very much. We're around this week. If you have additional questions about Level 1, happy to engage on that. Have a great conference day.